In the stillness of the night, when the world outside falls quiet and only the faintest of sounds move through the air, it is comforting to settle into the kind of story that does not demand attention, but rather drifts along like a gentle current. Tonight, the story is one that begins many centuries ago, in a world so far removed from ours that it feels at once distant and yet strangely familiar. It is the story of Theodora, a woman whose life began in obscurity, passed through shadows, and rose, slowly and against all odds, to the very heights of imperial power in the Byzantine world. It is not a story of battles and violence, though such things linger in the background of history. It is not a tale of grand dramatic gestures alone, but also one of small steps, of quiet changes, and of the strange turns of fortune that can guide a life. From the lowest of places to the loftiest of thrones. To imagine her world, we must drift backward in time, past the centuries that layer our history, past the kingdoms and empires that have risen and fallen, until we find ourselves in the city of Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean. The city was vast, wrapped in mighty walls, crowned with domes and towers, its streets lined with markets, baths, shrines, and palaces. The sea lapped at its harbors, and ships came and went, bearing spices, silks, wines, oils, and treasures from across the known world. It was here, in this bustling heart of the Byzantine Empire, that Theodora would one day reign as empress. But before we arrive at the throne, we begin in humbler places. Theodora's origins were not noble. She was born into the lower reaches of society, the daughter of a man who worked in the hippodrome, that great arena where chariots raced and crowds roared. Her father, Acacius, is said to have been a bearkeeper, tending the animals used in entertainments that filled the grand stadium with spectacle. The hippodrome was more than just sport. It was politics, entertainment, devotion, and community all tied together, and those who worked within its walls lived on the margins of its power and its noise. For Theodora, this was the beginning. When Acacius died, Theodora's family fell into difficulty. Her mother, now a widow, had to find a way to keep herself and her daughters afloat. And so, in a city where fortunes turned quickly, and where the difference between survival and hunger could be narrow, Theodora was led into the world of performance, and with performance, the shadows of the stage and the life of the brothel. In the Byzantine world, actresses often occupied a position looked down upon by polite society. The stage was associated with laughter, entertainment, and sometimes scandal, and those who performed were often thought of as little more than courtesans, bound to the gaze and the whims of others. For Theodora, her early years were shaped by this environment. She was young, striking, and clever, and she learned quickly how to survive in the demanding and sometimes cruel spaces of performance and pleasure. It was a world of flashing lights, painted faces, laughter that rang too loudly, and quiet tears behind curtains. But this is not where her story ends. Theodora, even as a girl, possessed a sharpness of wit and a strength of spirit that caught notice. She may not have had noble birth, but she had a mind that observed, learned, and adapted. She understood people, their desires, their fears, their ambitions. These qualities would one day serve her well, though in these early years they were simply tools for survival. We can imagine her walking through the crowded streets of Constantinople, past vendors calling out the prices of fruit and fish, past the baths where steam curled into the air, past the great churches with their flickering lamps, and into the quieter corners where shadows lingered. She would have seen the divisions of her city, the wealth of the powerful and the struggles of the poor. And though she was born among the latter, her path was far from ordinary. In her youth, Theodora left Constantinople, traveling eastward. Accounts speak of her journey to North Africa, to the bustling city of Alexandria, and even beyond, to Antioch and the lands further still. These were places of learning, of trade, and of deep spiritual reflection, where Christianity had already taken root and flourished in many different forms. While some details of her life during this time are hazy, blurred by legend and rumor, what remains clear is that Theodora changed. She shifted away from the life of performance and pleasure, and turned toward something quieter, something more profound. It was in these wandering years that she is said to have encountered new ways of thinking, new forms of belief, and perhaps new understandings of herself. She adopted a life of reflection, humility, and chastity. Whether this transformation was sudden or gradual, whether it was spurred by disappointment or by revelation, we may never know. But when she returned to Constantinople, She was no longer the same young woman who had left its stages. She had become thoughtful, disciplined, and perhaps even serene, though always keen, always perceptive, always strong. Back in Constantinople, Theodora's path crossed with that of Justinian, a man destined to become one of the most powerful rulers of the Byzantine Empire. Justinian himself had risen from modest origins, though not as humble as hers, and he was known for his sharp mind, his determination, and his grand vision for the empire. The meeting of Theodora and Justinian was not merely a chance encounter. It was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of a partnership that would reshape the course of an empire. When Justinian met Theodora, he did not see her as society might have judged her. He saw in her intelligence, wit, and strength. He saw a partner, not merely a companion, and Theodora, in turn, found in Justinian someone who valued her not just for beauty, but for her mind, her counsel, and her spirit. Their bond was strong, unusual in a world where marriages among the powerful were often matters of strategy rather than affection. There were obstacles, of course. The law itself forbade men of high rank from marrying actresses, for they were considered socially unsuitable. But Justinian, determined as ever, sought to change the law, and he did. The rules were altered, barriers removed, and soon after, Theodora and Justinian were married. From this moment onward, Theodora was no longer a woman on the margins. She was no longer the daughter of a bearkeeper, no longer the actress of the stage, no longer the wanderer seeking a place of belonging. She had become the wife of the future emperor, and in time, the empress herself, and so her life entered a new phase, one that would carry her not only into the heart of Byzantine politics, but into the very fabric of its history. Together with Justinian, she would face revolts, plagues, wars, and religious divisions. Together, they would rebuild a city shaken by fire and destruction. Together, they would craft laws, some of which carried her voice and her compassion for those who lived, as she once had, on the edges of respectability and power. Yet for now, as we linger in the early years of her rise, the pace of our story is calm. Theodora's journey is not a rush of sudden events, but a gradual unfolding, as though a tapestry were being woven one thread at a time. Each step along her path prepared her for what was to come. Each hardship, each lesson, each quiet observation strengthened her. Imagine, then, the city of Constantinople in the days before her reign. The golden dome of the Hagia Sophia not yet rebuilt in its grandest form, but still rising above the city. The palace walls overlooking the sea, where sailors and merchants came and went with cargoes from distant lands. The streets crowded with citizens of every kind, nobles in fine robes, clerks carrying tablets, soldiers in gleaming armor, beggars seeking alms, children running with laughter. And among them all, Theodora walked, no longer unnoticed, but still on the threshold of her destiny. Her story is one of transformation, from the shadows of the stage to the light of the throne, from the margins of society to its very center. It is a story that invites us not to judge quickly, but to see how the winding paths of life can lead to unexpected places. It is a story that reminds us that greatness can rise from unlikely beginnings, that wisdom can be born of hardship, and that strength can be found in those whom the world might overlook. As we drift further into her tale, let the rhythm of the past move gently, like the tide against the shore. Theodora's life was filled with trials and triumphs, but tonight, in the quiet hours, it is enough simply to walk beside her through the streets of her city, to pause in the dim light of lamps along the walls, and to watch as her destiny slowly takes shape in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Theodora's life, which had begun in the corners of the hippodrome and wandered through paths of performance and reflection, had now intertwined with the destiny of a man who was climbing toward the highest office of the empire. In the soft glow of lamplight within the halls of Constantinople, she and Justinian grew into a partnership that was unlike many others of their age. Where many noble women of the court were bound by custom, retreating behind veils and into quiet domestic spaces, Theodora emerged alongside her husband, her presence steady, her voice clear, and her will unbending. It is said that Justinian admired her judgment as much as her beauty. He did not dismiss her counsel, nor hide her from the gaze of politics. Instead, he sought her company in matters of law, governance, and religion. In the quiet chambers of the palace, the two of them would walk slowly across marble floors, pausing beneath painted ceilings that told stories of saints and emperors past, and they would speak together of plans for the city, for the empire, and for the lives of those within it. Their conversations were not those of mere formality. They were exchanges of ideas, of ambitions, of hopes that one day the empire might be restored to a glory long remembered but dimmed by time. Theodora had once lived among those who were scorned, those who carried burdens of shame and survival. She did not forget them. Perhaps in the quiet of the night, when the palace walls hushed the noise of the city, she remembered the dim theaters, the laughter that rang hollow, the exhaustion of faces painted with smiles. Perhaps she thought of women who sold themselves not because they desired it, but because there were no other paths open. These memories stayed with her, and when the moment came, they would shape the laws that bore her influence. But for now, she stood in the rising light of a new chapter. Justinian was still heir, not yet crowned, and yet the weight of leadership was already pressing upon him. The empire stretched wide, from the coasts of Italy to the deserts of Syria, from the mountains of Anatolia to the rich valleys of Egypt. It was a vast, diverse land, bound together by tradition and faith, but also troubled by divisions, by war at the edges, and by unrest within. Constantinople itself, though magnificent, was restless. The people of the city divided themselves passionately into factions, most famously the Blues and the Greens, supporters of rival chariot teams who clashed in the hippodrome, not only over races, but also over politics, loyalties, and rivalries that spilled into daily life. These divisions could ignite into flames quickly, and Theodora, having grown up close to the hippodrome, understood their force. She knew the energy of the crowd, the roar that could lift a man to glory or tear him down in fury. She knew how swiftly excitement could turn to violence. Perhaps this knowledge, carried from her father's profession and her own years near the arena, prepared her for the storm that would one day test her resolve more fiercely than any other. In the year 527, Justinian became emperor, and Theodora, standing beside him, was crowned Empress of the Byzantine Empire. In the great ceremony, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Hagia Sophia's earlier form, she was lifted into the radiance of imperial dignity. Robes of deep purple were draped across her shoulders, a crown heavy with jewels set upon her head, and before the eyes of nobles, clerics, and citizens alike, she was proclaimed Augusta, partner in rule, sovereign of the realm. For a woman of her origins, it was an ascent almost unimaginable, and yet, here she stood. That empire expected much of its rulers. The court was a place of splendor, but also of scrutiny, where every gesture, every word, every decision could ripple outward into the lives of thousands. Justinian, ambitious and tireless, dreamed of reconquering the lands once held by Rome, of restoring the empire's former boundaries, of building monuments that would outlast centuries. Theodora shared in his vision, but she also carried her own. She sought to use the mantle of authority not only for grandeur, but for protection, especially for those who, like herself, once had little voice. Soon after her coronation, laws began to shift. With Justinian's pen, guided in part by Theodora's heart, decrees were written that altered the lives of women in the empire. No longer could officials force women into prostitution against their will. Those who wished to leave the trade were offered aid and protection. Guardianship rights were granted, giving women more security over their property and dowries. These laws were not born of abstract philosophy, but of memory, of compassion, of a woman who had once felt the cold weight of society's judgment. Theodora's presence in the court did not go unnoticed. To some, she was a scandal, a woman of low origins who had climbed too high. Whispers moved through marble corridors, mutterings among nobles who thought her unworthy. But Theodora was not easily shaken. Her composure was steady, her dignity unassailable. She carried herself as though she had always been destined for the throne, and in time, even those who doubted were forced to acknowledge the strength of her role. The palace itself became a stage of quiet power. Behind high walls, gilded chambers opened onto courtyards filled with fountains, where the trickling of water mingled with the rustle of silk garments and the low murmur of servants. Within these spaces, Theodora received visitors, ambassadors, and petitioners. She listened, she judged, and she decided. Her voice mattered, and in the quiet hours, when ceremonies ended and the day's affairs fell silent, she and Justinian returned again to their conversations, weaving dreams for an empire that demanded both vision and resolve. But history has a way of testing the resolve of its figures. Only a few years into their reign, the empire was shaken by one of the most dangerous uprisings it would ever face. It began, as so many Byzantine tumults did, in the hippodrome, with the clamor of the factions. The blues and the greens, rivals in sport and politics alike, found themselves briefly united, their anger turning not on each other, but on the emperor himself. The causes were many: taxation, harsh punishments, political discontent. But in the winter of 530, frustration burst into flame. During a race, chants rose from the stands, not of loyalty, but of defiance. The cry of meaning conquer, thundered through the arena, and soon spilled into the streets. What began as shouts became riots, and what became riots turned swiftly into fire and blood. For days, Constantinople was seized by chaos. Flames devoured buildings. The air was thick with smoke. The golden domes darkened beneath clouds of ash. The crowd surged like a living storm, demanding the emperor's removal, calling for another to take his place. Justinian's rule, so newly begun, teetered on the brink of collapse. In the palace, fear ran high. Advisors urged retreat, flight, surrender. They counseled Justinian to abandon the throne and escape while there was still time. In the face of tens of thousands rising against him, it seemed the only way to preserve life. Yet, in this moment of deepest crisis, when all around faltered, it was Theodora who stood unshaken. She is remembered for her words. Words spoken calmly yet firmly, words that carried the weight of decision. To Justinian, wavering in uncertainty, she declared that she would not leave. She would not flee into exile. For her, the purple robes of royalty were not garments of luxury, but of dignity. To live in exile, stripped of honor, was no life at all. Royalty makes a fine burial shroud, she is said to have told him. Better, she urged, to remain and face whatever might come, than to abandon all they had fought to build. Those words, steady and uncompromising, strengthened Justinian's resolve. No longer would he flee. No longer would he hesitate. The emperor and empress, bound in will, chose to stand. And from that decision came the suppression of the uprising. Generals were called, plans were made, and soon, the hippodrome itself became the trap. The rioters, gathered within, were met with soldiers who poured in through the gates. What followed was swift and brutal. Tens of thousands cut down, the rebellion crushed, the city left smoldering in silence. The Nika riots, as they came to be known, marked both tragedy and turning point. Constantinople lay scarred, buildings in ruins, lives lost beyond count. Yet from the ashes, Justinian and Theodora would rebuild. The destruction of the old Hagia Sophia gave way to the vision of a new one, a church unlike any the world had seen before. Its vast dome, rising toward heaven, would crown the city and stand for centuries as a symbol of Byzantine grandeur. And Theodora, through it all, was remembered not as a woman who trembled, but as one who steadied the empire when even her husband faltered. Her courage became legend, a quiet resolve that spoke louder than any shout. When the smoke of the Nika riots at last cleared, and the streets of Constantinople lay quiet once more, the city was left scarred, but not broken. The great halls of power still stood, though charred. The wide avenues, lined with colonnades, still carried the echo of footsteps, though the paving stones were blackened in places by ash. The air, for a time, carried the lingering scent of burned timber and plaster. Yet life, as it always does, began to return. Merchants reopened their stalls. Bakers once more lit their ovens, filling the city with the familiar aroma of warm bread. Children ran through alleyways with laughter that rose like birdsong, chasing each other between marble fountains where the water still trickled cool and clear. Theodora and Justinian did not linger in grief over what was lost. They turned instead to what might be built anew. The fires of the riots, devastating though they had been, offered a strange opportunity. The old Hagia Sophia, collapsed and ruined, could be reborn in grandeur beyond anything the city had yet known. Architects were summoned, mathematicians consulted, artisans and laborers gathered. Slowly, the vision of a vast new basilica began to take form, a dome that would seem to float upon the air itself, light streaming through windows set high, marble and gold shimmering like the heavens. But even as construction began, life in the empire did not pause. Theodora, steady in her role, turned her thoughts to those who lived not in palaces or among colonnades, but in the narrow lanes, the crowded inns, and the modest courtyards where life unfolded in smaller rhythms. She remembered, as she always did, the women who had no one to protect them, those who were sold into lives they had not chosen, those who bore burdens too heavy for their shoulders. In council with Justinian, she pressed for laws that would extend protection, laws that carried compassion into the structure of the empire itself. Edicts were written, that forbade the trafficking of young girls into brothels. Officials who attempted to force women into such lives were punished. Safe houses were established, where those who wished to leave prostitution might find shelter, food, and the chance to begin again. Theodora's hand can be felt in these measures. Her memory of hardship turned into a shield for others. In a world where women were so often silent, her voice rang with quiet strength. Yet her influence was not limited to law. The palace itself became a place where her presence shaped the rhythm of life. She received delegations, listened to disputes, and sat in judgment. The courtiers who once whispered against her learned that she could not be dismissed, for her words carried weight with the emperor himself. In silk-draped chambers, beneath mosaics that glittered with scenes of saints and angels, she spoke with clarity and command. Those who sought to undermine her found instead a woman unshaken, her composure as firm as marble, her eyes steady as the domes that crowned the city skyline dot beyond the palace walls. Constantinople lived in a harmony of movement and sound. At dawn, the call of vendors rose as shutters opened along the Mazy, the great main street that cut through the city. The fragrance of honeycakes mingled with the salt air from the Bosporus. Fishermen displayed their catch upon wooden stalls, scales flashing silver in the morning light. Potters stacked jars, their surfaces still warm from the kiln. Weavers unrolled bolts of cloth dyed in hues of deep blue and crimson, and among them, monks walked with bowed heads, their dark robes brushing the stones, while soldiers in armor passed with the slow rhythm of marching boots. The baths, too, were a constant presence in daily life. There, amid clouds of steam and the quiet splash of water, citizens gathered not only to cleanse the body, but to converse, to exchange news, to conduct small dealings. The warmth of the pools, the scent of oils rubbed into skin, the low hum of voices, all of it formed the texture of ordinary existence. Even in times of uncertainty, these rituals remained, anchoring the city in familiarity. Theodora, though she lived within walls of marble and gold, never forgot the life outside them. She knew that laws, to matter, must touch the streets where bakers and weavers worked, must reach into the homes where mothers soothed children to sleep. And so her influence was steady, pushing always toward compassion, toward dignity, toward the protection of those most easily forgotten. Religion, too, weighed heavily upon the empire. In those years, theological disputes often stirred as much passion as politics, dividing communities over questions of doctrine and faith. The schism between Chalcedonian and Miaphysite Christians ran deep, shaping loyalties and igniting debates in both public forums and private chambers. Justinian, ever determined to unify, pressed for consensus, but Theodora leaned toward sympathy for the Miaphysites, offering them protection when others condemned them. She opened the palace as a place of refuge, and her efforts shielded bishops and monks who might otherwise have been driven into exile. This was not merely politics. For Theodora, faith was lived not in abstract arguments alone, but in compassion for those who suffered. In quiet chapels lit by flickering oil lamps, she prayed with sincerity. In her presence, women of the court found a leader who understood them, not only as ornaments of the empire, but as human souls. She extended her patronage to convents, providing spaces where women might devote their lives to devotion and learning, free from the pressures of marriage or servitude. And so her reign unfolded, not in thunderous proclamations alone, but in small, steady acts of care. The city rebuilt itself, marble rising where ashes had lain, gilded mosaics pieced together with patient hands, domes lifting toward heaven like prayers cast into the sky. Yet beneath these splendors, the quieter stories of daily life continued. Bakers kneading dough before dawn, fishermen casting nets into waters that glittered in morning light, children chasing each other through courtyards where ivy clung to stone. Theodora herself walked through the palace gardens, where cypress trees rose tall and the scent of roses mingled with the salt air from the sea. Peacocks strolled across the lawns, their feathers gleaming like scattered jewels. Servants carried trays of figs and pomegranates, their skins glowing deep red and gold. And in the evenings, as the sun sank behind the walls, casting the city in shades of amber and violet, she would look out over the waters and the domes, her mind resting not only on the glories of empire, but on the fragility of human lives within it. Her legacy was not without opposition. There were always those who whispered, who resented her origins, who bristled at her authority. Yet her strength lay not in silencing them, but in remaining unshaken by them. She knew who she had been, and she knew who she had become. Theodora did not seek to erase her past, but to transform it, to turn its hardships into wisdom, its wounds into compassion, its trials into unyielding resolve. Years passed in this rhythm, years in which the city grew, laws took root, churches rose, and the empire stretched its influence. Justinian pursued his conquests, sending generals like Belisarius to reclaim lands in North Africa and Italy. Victories were celebrated, parades wound through the city, and the people once more crowded the hippodrome, their cheers rising like thunder beneath the vast sky. Yet in the palace, Theodora's steady hand remained, guiding, advising, and protecting, her presence a constant in the shifting tides of empire. As night descended upon the city, lamps were lit in windows, their glow like stars scattered across the darkened streets. The soft murmur of prayer drifted from chapels, mingling with the hush of the sea against the harbor walls. Families gathered in their courtyards, sharing bread and olives, while musicians plucked strings that echoed gently in the night air. And above them all, in the quiet chambers of the palace, Theodora watched over an empire that had once seemed beyond her reach, her journey from shadow to throne complete, yet still unfolding. One moment of compassion, one act of resolve, one quiet decision at a time. In the years that followed the Nika riots, the empire seemed to breathe with renewed determination. The scars of fire upon the streets of Constantinople had not yet vanished, and yet new structures began to rise with astonishing speed. Theodora and Justinian, resolved never again to falter in the face of crisis, turned their energy toward creation, toward reordering the empire and reshaping it in both stone and law. For Justinian, the dream of Rome still shimmered like a vision on the horizon. Though centuries had passed since the fall of the Western Empire, he did not see its demise as final. He believed that the Mediterranean world, fractured though it was, could be drawn again under one rule, that old provinces lost to Vandals, Goths, and other kingdoms might once again hear the voice of the emperor in Constantinople. He labored endlessly, his eyes never weary, his mind ceaseless in its pursuit of order, and beside him, Theodora matched his will with her own. Her energy was less outwardly grand, yet equally enduring. She did not march at the head of armies, nor bend architects to the demands of geometry and stone. Instead, her work lay in the realm of lives often unseen by history, women caught in cycles of exploitation, children abandoned on streets, the poor and voiceless who were rarely heard in chambers of power. The law itself became a canvas upon which both Justinian and Theodora painted their visions. The emperor commissioned the codification of centuries of Roman law, a monumental task that gathered jurists, scholars, and scribes, and that would produce the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, destined to echo across Europe for centuries. For Justinian, this was the culmination of his belief in order. That law should not be scattered like fragments, but bound into a coherent whole. And within this great body of law, one can sense Theodora's influence. Provisions appear that bear the mark of her compassion and her memory of hardship. Laws against forced prostitution, protections for women who chose to leave brothels, punishments for men who seduced and abandoned women without marriage. These were not the concerns of emperors alone. They reflect the presence of an empress who remembered a time when women had little shield against exploitation, who knew intimately the weight of desperation and the cruelty of society's judgment. Imagine her in the palace, sitting among scrolls and codices, hearing petitions from those who sought relief, listening with quiet intensity. The chambers were cool, the marble floors smooth beneath sandaled feet, the air perfumed faintly with incense drifting from nearby chapels. Advisors murmured, scribes bent their heads over wax tablets, and amid this steady hum of governance, Theodora spoke with clarity, guiding laws toward justice, toward mercy, toward the acknowledgement of humanity, even in the least powerful. Outside those walls, Constantinople pulsed with its daily rhythms. The city never slept entirely. At dawn, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers rang through narrow streets, iron shaping into tools and weapons. Bakers opened their ovens, sending the fragrance of loaves wafting into the cool air, mingling with the salt scent of the Bosporus. Merchants spread their wares along wooden stalls, silks from the east that shimmered like liquid light, spices whose aromas told of distant deserts and mountains, carved ivories and glass that caught the sun. Children darted between the stalls, laughing, their voices carrying over the hum of bargaining. Women in long tunics moved with baskets balanced upon their heads, their steps steady along cobbled paths. Monks, their robes dark and plain, wound through the crowd silently, while soldiers, their helmets gleaming, stood at intervals to keep watch. The sounds of the city blended into a symphony, the creak of wagon wheels, the splash of oars at the harbor, the distant chant of prayers from churches opening their doors to the morning. Life in Byzantium was rich with ritual. Families gathered at public baths, where marble halls echoed with voices, and steam curled upward into the high arches. Men and women separated into their own sections, washing, conversing, sometimes conducting small business or arranging marriages. In shaded courtyards, fountains spilled cool water, and gardens bloomed with roses, jasmine, and cypress trees, their fragrance drifting into the air. Amid all this daily life, the shadow of imperial presence was never far. Coins stamped with Justinian's face passed from hand to hand. Decrees inscribed upon tablets were read aloud in forums. The sight of the palace itself, rising above the sea, reminded citizens that the emperor and empress watched over them, that their decisions shaped the very bread sold in markets, the taxes paid by merchants, the marriages sealed in chapels. Theodora, though exalted, was not distant. She received petitions directly from women, listening to their pleas in chambers hung with silken curtains, where the light filtered softly through colored glass. Some came weeping, some fearful, some trembling with hope. To each, she gave her attention, her calm presence easing their anxieties. For those abandoned by husbands, she sought restitution. For those beaten or abused, she demanded protection. For those cast aside by society, she offered refuge in convents and shelters funded by her patronage. Among the most notable of these refuges was a house established near the Bosphorus, where women who had been trapped in prostitution could begin new lives. Here they were taught weaving and embroidery, given food and lodging, and protected from those who sought to drag them back into misery. The walls of this house echoed with prayers of gratitude, with the steady rhythm of hands working threads into cloth, with the quiet rediscovery of dignity. It stood as a testament to Theodora's conviction that no one, however despised by society, was beyond hope. Religion, too, remained ever present in her thoughts. The empire was divided in belief, torn between the Chalcedonian definition of Christ's nature and the Miaphysite position that saw him as united in one. Too many, these were not abstract theological points, but questions of identity, of loyalty, of eternal truth. Justinian, ever eager to unify, leaned toward enforcing orthodoxy. Yet Theodora, with her own sympathies, extended protection to Miaphysite leaders, shielding them from exile, offering them quiet corners of refuge within the palace, or in monasteries supported by her hand. It was whispered among courtiers that her influence was strong in these matters, that without her, many would have been cast out, silenced, or destroyed. But with her, they endured, continuing to write, to teach, to pray. The palace itself became a place where debates of faith mingled with daily rituals of governance, where bishops in flowing robes passed scribes with ink-stained hands, where the scent of incense drifted even into rooms where taxes and laws were discussed. Yet life was not all solemnity. Festivals lit the city with color and song. In the hippodrome, races resumed, the thunder of chariots thrilling the crowds. Blue and green factions still cheered, though the memory of riots lingered. Musicians played lyres and flutes in taverns, their notes mingling with laughter and the clink of cups filled with sweet wine. Actors performed in theaters, comedies and tragedies alike, their voices carrying into the night. Dancers twirled in courtyards, their garments flowing like ripples of water. In these moments, the city breathed joy, even beneath the weight of empire. And Theodora, though often bound to the dignity of her station, surely knew of these festivities, perhaps smiling faintly at the sound of distant cheers drifting through the palace windows, perhaps remembering her own early days on the stage. Though those days were far behind her, the empire itself, beyond Constantinople, stretched wide and varied. In Egypt, farmers bent over the fertile soil of the Nile, harvesting grain that fed the capital. In Syria, caravans wound slowly across deserts, camels swaying beneath the weight of spices and silks. In Anatolia, shepherds guided flocks across hills where wildflowers bloomed in spring. In Thrace, vineyards stretched over rolling slopes, their grapes destined for wine poured in taverns and palaces alike. All of it flowed toward Constantinople, the beating heart of the empire, where Theodora and Justinian ruled. Years passed, and the empire shifted under their guidance. Justinian's armies marched westward, reclaiming Carthage from the Vandals, pressing into Italy, challenging Gothic kings. Victories brought triumphs, and the city celebrated with parades of soldiers, the clang of arms echoing beneath marble arches. Yet war also brought costs, coffers drained, men lost, families grieving. Through it all, Theodora remained in Constantinople, her presence steady, her counsel constant. She received reports, advised her husband, and tempered his ambition with reminders of the human toll. In the palace gardens, she sometimes walked at dusk, her steps soft along gravel paths, the air cooling as the sun slipped into the horizon. Birds settled in cypress branches, their calls gentle. Fountains whispered as water spilled into basins carved with vines and flowers. Around her, servants moved quietly, carrying trays of fruit, figs glistening with sweetness, pomegranates split to reveal their jeweled seeds. She would pause, gazing across the waters of the Bosporus, where ships drifted like shadows, their sails catching the last light of day. It is easy to imagine her reflecting then, not only on the burdens of empire, but on the strange turns of her own life, from the daughter of a bearkeeper, to the performer scorned by society, to the wanderer seeking refuge in distant lands, to the empress whose voice shaped laws and whose will steadied an empire. The arc of her life was as vast as the dome of the Hagia Sophia that now rose, nearing completion, its golden roof gleaming like the sun itself, and within that basilica, still under construction, artisans climbed scaffolds, setting mosaics piece by piece, each fragment of glass shimmering when caught by light. The scent of wet plaster mingled with incense offered in prayer. The voices of workers rose in song to pass the long hours. And slowly, stone by stone, color by color, the vision of heaven on earth took shape, a place where the faithful would gather, where their prayers would rise into the vast dome, where light itself seemed to descend and raise through windows set high in the walls. This, too, was part of Theodora's legacy, for though Justinian's name would be forever bound to the Hagia Sophia, she was present in its conception, its planning, its rise from ashes. Together, they envisioned not only a church, but a symbol of eternity, a beacon that would endure long after their voices were silent. And so, as night deepened over Constantinople, lamps flickered in windows, their glow soft against the stone walls. The streets quieted, save for the distant bark of dogs, or the slow creak of a cart returning late from the fields. In the palace, silence settled across vast halls, broken only by the gentle tread of guards on patrol. Within their private chambers, Justinian bent still over scrolls and plans, his mind restless, and Theodora, serene yet watchful, guided him with her calm words, her steady presence, her memory of hardship transformed into strength. The empire was vast, the burdens heavy, the future uncertain. Yet, in those years after the Nika riots, amid the rebuilding of churches, the reform of laws, the extension of compassion, Theodora's star shone brightest. She was not a shadow behind the emperor, but a light beside him. Her influence woven into the very fabric of Byzantine life, into the bread baked each morning, the prayers whispered each night, the mosaics that glimmered in candlelight, the laws that shielded the forgotten. And as the city slept, its people wrapped in dreams. The empress who had once known the silence of obscurity now watched over them, her life forever entwined with the destiny of the empire. When dawn rose again over Constantinople, the city awoke to a season of building that would culminate in one of the greatest marvels of human history. The Hagia Sophia, born out of the ashes of riot and rebellion, advanced toward completion, its foundations already anchored deep, its walls stretching skyward, its dome, a vision still in progress, yet visible to all who passed. Each day, citizens walked near the site and gazed upward, marveling at the growing structure, whispering to one another that it would surpass all that came before. The construction site itself was a world of ordered chaos. Workers arrived with the first light, their sandals crunching against gravel, voices calling out in a dozen tongues, for artisans and laborers had come from across the empire. Massive blocks of stone quarried from distant lands lay in neat stacks, their pale surfaces catching the morning sun. Oxen strained as they hauled timber beams, their breaths steaming in the chill air. The clang of chisels rang out, the strike of hammer on stone producing a rhythm that seemed to echo across the district like a heartbeat. Scaffolds stretched upward, lattice of wood, rising along the walls, swaying slightly as men ascended with tools and baskets of mortar. Rope pulleys creaked, raising heavy materials toward the growing arches. Dust filled the air, mingling with the fragrance of nearby gardens and the faint salt carried in from the sea. And above it all stood architects and foremen, directing with gestures and measured words, ensuring that each piece of stone, each curve of arch, aligned with the vast vision held in Justinian's mind. But within the palace, Theodora did not view this work merely as stone and mortar. She saw it as an act of spiritual restoration. The city, wounded by the destruction of riot and the uncertainty of conflict, needed a symbol of divine order, a reassurance that heaven itself dwelt among them. Each night, when she and Justinian retired from the long affairs of governance, they spoke of it, the dome that would rise not only above the city but above centuries, a canopy of gold and light, a place where even the weary and broken might feel touched by eternity. As weeks passed into months, the interior began to take form. Marble slabs arrived from every corner of the empire, each with its own hue, greens veined with silver from Thessaly, purples deep as twilight from Egypt, gleaming whites from the islands of the Aegean. Carvers polished them until they reflected torchlight like water. Columns, tall and fluted, were raised and set upon bases adorned with intricate carvings of vines and crosses. Mosaics, made of tiny tesserae of glass and gold, began to cover the walls, shimmering when the sun entered through the high windows. Workers often sang to pass the long hours, their voices mingling in haunting harmonies. Some sang of home, of distant villages where olive trees swayed in the wind. Others sang hymns, praising God as their hands fitted stone to stone. Their songs rose with the dust and light, filling the vast interior with a music that seemed already like prayer. And as candles flickered in the growing twilight, overseers dismissed them to their families, leaving the half-built basilica quiet, its arches echoing with the faint rustle of pigeons, nesting high in the scaffolds. The city's people followed the progress eagerly. Merchants paused in their selling to glance toward the rising dome. Mothers carried their children to see it, pointing upward, as if to impress upon them that they were witnessing history. Old men leaned on staffs and murmured that no such wonder had been seen in living memory. And when they spoke of it, they did not speak only of Justinian. They spoke, too, of Theodora, for they knew her presence was constant in these affairs, her will no less firm than his. Beyond Constantinople, the empire strained under the weight of Justinian's ambitions. Armies marched westward, and the Mediterranean became again a sea of war. The Vandals of North Africa fell, their kingdom toppled, their ships taken. In triumph, generals returned to the capital with prisoners and treasures, and the city celebrated with feasts and processions. Children waved palm branches, incense burned in the streets, trumpets sounded from the towers. Yet even as joy filled the air, there lingered the quiet knowledge that war always exacted its cost, that victories abroad were bought with lives lost, and taxes raised at home. Theodora, though she remained in the city, felt these strains. She heard petitions from widows whose husbands had fallen, from families who struggled under new levies. With gentle words, she soothed them, and with her counsel, she reminded Justinian that his dream of empire was born not only on battlefields, but also on the shoulders of those who tilled the soil, baked the bread, wove the cloth, and prayed each evening in small chapels lit by single candles. Life in Constantinople continued in its endless rhythm. At dawn, fishermen rowed their boats into the waters of the Bosporus, casting nets that shimmered as they fell, hauling them back heavy with silver fish. Their wives salted the catch, preparing it for markets where buyers gathered in the morning chill. Artisans opened their workshops, potters shaping clay upon wheels, the soft hum of spinning echoing in the narrow rooms. Metal workers hammering bronze into lamps and bowls, sparks flying like brief stars. Weavers guiding looms with steady hands, threads crossing into patterns that would decorate homes and altars alike. Children carried messages through the streets, darting between donkeys laden with baskets of figs and jars of oil. Priests in dark robes moved solemnly from church to church, bells ringing softly to announce the morning services. In the hippodrome, trainers worked with horses, their hooves drumming against packed earth as they prepared for the next races that would fill the stands with shouting voices. Evenings brought their own quiet beauty. Lamps lit the colonnades, their flames wavering in the wind. Families gathered around simple meals of bread, cheese, olives, and wine, their laughter carrying across courtyards as the stars emerged. Storytellers recited tales of old heroes, their voices low and melodic, while listeners rested against cushions, half drifting into dreams. The city seemed to sigh with contentment, even as shadows lengthened and the future remained uncertain. Theodora herself moved through these rhythms in a life both elevated and burdened. She held audiences in richly adorned halls, where silken curtains swayed in faint breezes and polished floors mirrored the light of golden lamps. Yet even in such splendor, she carried herself with calm restraint, never forgetting the path that had brought her here. Courtiers whispered of her sharp wit, her unwavering resolve, her capacity to speak plainly when others hesitated. And when she retired from public affairs, she sought peace in gardens and chapels, in the soft glow of icons, in the fragrance of roses blooming beneath palace walls. As Hagia Sophia neared completion, anticipation gripped the city. People whispered that when its dome finally rose, it would appear as if suspended from heaven itself. A golden canopy hung not by stone and mortar, but by divine hand. And indeed, when the day of dedication arrived, it seemed so. Crowds gathered in the square, filling every space, their voices hushed in awe. The emperor and empress, robed in splendor, entered with solemn grace. Inside, light streamed through windows set high above, falling upon marble and mosaic until the entire interior seemed to glow. The dome soared, vast and radiant, its golden surface catching the flicker of thousands of candles. Chants rose from choirs, deep and resonant, echoing upward until they seemed to dissolve into heaven. Theodora stood with Justinian as prayers were offered, her face serene, her gaze steady. She knew that this was more than stone, more than architecture. It was a sanctuary for souls, a promise that amid turmoil, amid the fragile weave of human life, there remained a space of eternal light. And as the chants filled the air, as incense curled upward like smoke from an offering, she must have felt within herself the quiet certainty that this, too, was part of her journey from the shadows of obscurity to the heart of empire, from the dust of the stage to the golden glow of eternity. Beyond the basilica's walls, life continued in its patient rhythm. Merchants packed their stalls, donkeys brayed in narrow alleys, children laughed as they played with hoops and sticks. The sea lapped gently at the city's edge. Yet, above it all, the dome now loomed, watching, blessing, reminding each soul that something eternal dwelt among them. And so, with Hagia Sophia completed, the empire seemed for a moment to stand at the height of glory. But history, like the sea, is never still. The waves of fortune would rise and fall again. Wars would continue, plagues would come, and Theodora's health itself would one day falter. Yet in this season, when the great church opened its doors and the empire rejoiced, she stood at the center of it all, steadfast, luminous, and eternal in the memory of those who would come after. In the years that followed the consecration of Hagia Sophia, the empire seemed to stand at a height unmatched in memory. The golden dome rose above the city as though it were a fragment of heaven itself, gleaming even in the pale light of dawn, glowing like a great lantern at sunset. Its brilliance reflected in the waters of the Bosphorus. Pilgrims traveled great distances simply to gaze upon it, to enter its vast interior and hear their voices echo as though magnified by eternity. Constantinople, crowned by such a marvel, appeared unshakable, as though no storm could darken its skies. Yet the world beyond the city was rarely still. Justinian's armies pressed deeper into Italy, challenging the Gothic kingdom that had ruled there since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Battles raged across hills and valleys, where old Roman roads still stretched, cracked and overgrown yet enduring. Cities that had known centuries of history once again heard the clash of steel, the cries of soldiers, the thundering advance of cavalry. In Constantinople, news of these campaigns arrived in fragments, dispatches carried by weary messengers, letters sealed with wax and dusted by travel. Justinian, ever tireless, studied each report late into the night, his brow furrowed in thought, his mind calculating not only the movements of armies, but the weight of supplies, the loyalty of generals, the mood of distant populations. Theodora listened as well, her voice steady in council. Where Justinian dreamed of reconquest, of restoring Rome in its old splendor, she saw also the strain upon the empire. She reminded him of the widows left behind, of the farmers whose fields lay untended while sons marched away, of the merchants whose ships carried not goods but weapons. Her counsel was not to deny his dream, but to temper it, to steady the balance between vision and burden. Meanwhile, life within Constantinople unfolded with its familiar rhythm, as if indifferent to the tides of distant war. The city breathed each morning with the cry of market sellers calling out their wares. Women moved gracefully through crowded alleys, baskets of figs or loaves balanced upon their heads. The smell of roasted fish and seasoned lamb drifted from taverns where men gathered even in early hours, speaking in low voices of politics, of theology, of the latest rumors of war. Children's laughter spilled through the narrow streets as they played simple games, tossing stones or chasing hoops. Dogs barked lazily, wagging their tails at the scents drifting from bakeries. In shaded courtyards, fountains gurgled softly, water spilling into carved basins where pigeons dipped their beaks. Monks in simple robes walked quietly past, their steps measured, their eyes lowered, their lips moving in murmured prayer. For those who labored, the city was a place of endless motion. Potters turned their wheels, shaping clay with practiced hands, while their apprentices carried jars to be fired in hot kilners. Weavers sat at looms, the steady rhythm of shuttle against thread like a heartbeat in the dim rooms. Smiths hammered bronze into lamps, iron into nails, silver into cups and ornaments, sparks flying and fading like brief stars. The hum of labor filled the streets, each craft sustaining the city's vast body. Yet even amid such ordinary life, the presence of empire was never absent. Edicts were posted upon walls, their words read aloud by heralds, so that even the illiterate might know the will of their rulers. Coins with the emperor's likeness passed through countless hands each day, a silent reminder of authority. Soldiers stood watch at gates and forums, their armor polished, their faces stern, though their hearts perhaps longed for homes far away. Within the palace, Theodora continued her quiet work of compassion. She met with bishops, with widows, with women seeking protection. In rooms filled with soft light filtering through colored glass, she spoke with calm precision, her words carrying both firmness and warmth. She continued to support shelters for those leaving the life of brothels, places where the weary might find not only safety but dignity. She arranged for dowries, enabling young women to marry or enter convents. She gave voice to those long silenced by fear or shame. Evenings in the palace were often serene. After long hours of council, Justinian might pace the colonnades, his mind restless, always reaching for new plans, new reforms, new visions. Theodora would walk beside him, her presence steady, her words gentle yet unyielding. Servants lit lamps that cast golden light upon marble, their flames flickering in the night air. Beyond the walls, the city stretched in quiet hum, voices fading, waters lapping, stars emerging one by one. And yet, though the city seemed tranquil, whispers began to circulate of illness spreading in distant lands. Travelers spoke of fevers that seized the body suddenly, of swellings that rose upon the skin, of deaths that came with terrifying speed. At first these were distant tales, spoken in hushed tones in taverns or murmured in markets. But as months passed, the whispers grew nearer. Ships that arrived in harbor carried not only goods, but rumor of sickness. And soon enough, reality itself. Before the plague came in full force, life remained outwardly unchanged, and it is worth lingering here in the rhythms of an ordinary day. For it is these textures that ground the story of empire in the pulse of humanity. Picture a morning in one of the city's many neighborhoods. The sun rises over tiled rooftops, painting them with a soft glow. Women open shutters, shaking dust from woven rugs, letting fresh air flow into rooms scented with yesterday's cooking. Men prepare tools for their work, carpenters sharpening chisels, masons gathering hammers, scribes arranging ink and parchment. Children tumble out into courtyards, their hair tousled, their eyes bright with mischief, playing until mothers call them back for bread dipped in olive oil. In a nearby street, the clatter of hooves announces a procession. A magistrate rides through, accompanied by guards. Citizens step aside, some bowing slightly, others watching with quiet curiosity. The magistrate's cloak sways in the morning air, his face grave, his thoughts perhaps already on matters of taxes, disputes, or decrees. At noon the heat grows, and the city slows. Merchants fan themselves in shaded stalls. Dogs sleep in doorways, their bodies stretched across cool stone. In public baths, men and women seek relief in pools of water, steam rising into domed chambers, voices carrying in echoes. Here, they speak not only of business but of philosophy, of faith, of stories told by travelers. The baths are more than places of cleansing. They are centers of conversation, of community, of the subtle weaving of society. By evening, the streets come alive again. Lamps flicker in taverns, where wine is poured into clay cups, and laughter fills the air. Musicians pluck strings of lyres, flutes sing their high notes, drums keep gentle rhythm, dancers twirl in courtyards, their garments swirling like petals in the wind. Storytellers hold audiences wrapped with tales of Alexander, of Achilles, of saints and martyrs, their words flowing like rivers through the night. That families gather around modest meals. Bread is torn, olives shared, cheese sliced. Children curl against their parents, listening to voices that lull them toward sleep. The city quiets once more, its hum fading into silence, broken only by the distant call of night watchmen or the occasional bark of a dog. Such was daily life, unremarkable in its details, yet rich in its humanity. And it was within this tapestry of ordinary rhythms that Theodora's influence was most deeply felt. She did not merely sit upon a throne, she walked among her people in spirit, shaping laws that touched the lives of bakers, weavers, widows, and children. Her compassion was not abstract, it was woven into bread, into shelter, into the soft light of hope where once there had been none. But even as she labored, the horizon darkened. The wars in Italy dragged on, consuming more men, more gold, more time. The Gothic resistance proved stubborn, and victory, though claimed in moments, slipped again into uncertainty. At home, taxes weighed heavily. Merchants muttered in markets. Farmers in fields felt the burden of sending grain not only to the city but to armies abroad. And through it all, the quiet rumor of plague crept closer, until at last it would no longer remain rumor. For now, though, let us linger a little longer in this fragile peace. In the quiet before the storm, the Hagia Sophia stood completed, its dome gleaming in sunlight. The markets bustled with life, their stalls crowded with silks, spices, and jewels from distant lands. Children laughed, lovers strolled, prayers rose from chapels, and lamps flickered in the gathering dark. Theodora moved with grace through her days, firm in her resolve, steady in her compassion, luminous in her presence. The empire breathed, vast and restless, its heart beating within the walls of Constantinople. And though shadows gathered at the edges, in this moment, life endured, vivid, tender, ordinary, eternal. The first signs came quietly, almost unnoticed, as whispers drifting through taverns and markets. Sailors who arrived at the harbors spoke of sickness in distant ports, of sudden fevers that burned high and then fell silent in death. Merchants from Egypt told of caravans disrupted, villages hushed, fields untended. At first, Constantinople listened with a kind of uneasy detachment. Disease was always somewhere else, beyond the horizon, a tale told by travelers that might fade like smoke in the wind. But the city was a crossroads of the world, its harbors open to every sea, its markets tied to every road. And so, as inevitably as night follows day, the plague reached its walls. It came first in the form of small absences, a stall in the marketplace left empty, its usual owner unseen, a workshop shuttered, the sound of hammer or loom silenced. Then, in quiet houses, families withdrew, tending to those who burned with fever. Physicians, summoned with urgency, shook their heads in sorrow. The sickness spread like a tide. Narrow streets, once filled with the clamor of voices, grew quieter. Taverns that had rung with laughter now hushed, their lamps dimmed, their benches empty. The baths, once crowded, grew still, the pools reflecting the silence of vaulted ceilings. Markets thinned, stalls fewer, voices subdued. The sound of bells began to carry not only prayers but laments, their tolling soft, steady, sorrowful. Yet even as fear touched the city, life's rhythms continued, though slower, more fragile. Bakers still rose at dawn, kneading bread with weary hands, their loaves offered to those who came in fewer numbers than before. Fishermen still cast nets into the Bosporus, their boats swaying gently on the water, though their eyes were shadowed by worry. Mothers still gathered children close, offering food and stories, their voices gentler than ever, as if to shield them with love from unseen shadows. Within the palace, the burden grew heavy. Justinian himself was struck by the sickness, his body seized with fever, his strength faltering. For days the empire trembled, uncertain whether its emperor would endure. Ministers and generals waited in anxious silence, the city holding its breath. and at his side, Theodora remained steadfast. She did not yield to fear. She sat beside him in quiet vigil, her hand cool upon his brow, her voice soothing as she whispered prayers and words of strength. For Theodora had always carried within her the memory of hardship, of struggles survived, illness, loss, uncertainty. These were not strangers to her, and so, while others faltered, she stood firm, a pillar of calm amid the storm. She commanded servants with precision, ensuring physicians had all they required, ordering prayers in chapels, offering alms to those in need. Even as her own heart must have quaked, she allowed no sign of fear to show. To the emperor, to the court, to the people, she was steady, unyielding. Luminous dot, outside the palace walls, the city bore its grief in silence. Streets once alive with games and laughter, now held only the slow steps of priests carrying incense, their chants low and mournful. Families lit candles at their doors, their flames flickering in the night, as prayers drifted upward. In courtyards, neighbors gathered, not in joy but in shared consolation, their voices hushed, their eyes glistening with unshed tears. And yet, even amid sorrow, life persisted. Flowers still bloomed in gardens, their petals opening to the morning sun. Birds still called at dawn, their songs clear and bright above the hush. The sea still lapped at the shores, its tides unbroken, its rhythm eternal. The city, wounded, did not cease to breathe. When Justinian at last recovered, when fever loosened its grip and strength returned to his body, the city exhaled in relief. Bells rang not for mourning but for thanksgiving. Citizens lit lamps in gratitude, their glow soft against the dark. And in the palace, Justinian, weary but resolute, rose again to his labors. He spoke of his survival as a gift of divine mercy, a sign that his mission to restore order, law, and empire was not yet finished. Theodora, too, emerged from the shadows of fear with renewed purpose. She had watched the city tremble, had felt its sorrow, had seen its endurance. She knew that the empire was not built only on stone and law, but on the resilience of its people, on the quiet strength of ordinary lives that endured through hardship. And she carried this knowledge into her work, shaping laws and offering compassion with deeper conviction than ever. After the storm of illness, the city sought to restore its rhythms. Markets reopened, though with fewer voices. Taverns lit their lamps again, though their laughter was softer, more subdued. The baths welcomed visitors, the pools reflecting both relief and remembrance. Children once again played in courtyards, their games filling the air with joy that seemed brighter for the silence that had come before. Life slowly returned, though not unchanged. Families remembered, names were whispered in prayers, absences felt at every table. The city bore its scars quietly, carrying them as part of its endless story. And within the palace, Theodora's presence remained a comfort, her voice steady, her compassion deepened by all that had passed. It is worth pausing here, to linger in the details of how Byzantines lived in this season of recovery, for the essence of their endurance lies not in grand monuments, but in the gentle persistence of daily life. Imagine a morning after the worst had passed, the sky clear, the air bright with the scent of the sea. A baker, weary yet resolute, stirs his dough, flour dusting his arms, his face softened by the warmth of the oven. A mother, her eyes shadowed with memory, lifts her child, kissing the small forehead as sunlight spills through a window. Fishermen haul nets heavy with silver fish, their laughter returning, tentative but real. As they mend ropes together. In churches, candles flicker before icons of Christ and the Virgin, their wax dripping slowly, their flames steady as prayers rise once more in gratitude. Choirs sing hymns that echo upward into domes, their harmonies carrying both sorrow and hope, both memory and renewal. The scent of incense curls into the air, mingling with the fragrance of fresh flowers laid upon altars. The evenings bring gentle gatherings. Families share meals of lentils, bread, and figs, their voices low but tender. Storytellers return to courtyards, their words soft, weaving tales of saints and heroes, offering comfort in the familiar rhythm of narrative. Musicians pluck lyres with quiet grace, their notes drifting like lullabies into the night. Such details may seem small, yet they are the very fabric of endurance. The city did not triumph with sword or decree, but with bread baked, with prayers whispered, with love given and received in silence. Theodora knew this deeply, and it shaped her vision of what it meant to rule, to serve, to endure. As seasons turned, the empire looked once again beyond its walls. Justinian's ambition had not waned, though the plague had reminded him of life's fragility. Armies pressed again in the west, generals writing of victories and losses, of sieges and marches. Yet within the city, the true strength of empire remained in its people, in the way they lived each day with dignity, with resilience, with hope. And through it all, Theodora stood beside her husband, her influence constant, her compassion woven into law and life alike. She had faced riot, she had faced war, she had faced plague, and still she endured. Her voice continued to shape justice, her presence continued to comfort the afflicted, her memory of hardship continued to guide her heart. The dome of Hagia Sophia still gleamed, its golden surface catching the sun each morning, reflecting light across the city. To all who saw it, it was a reminder not only of divine majesty, but of human resilience, of a people who endured, of a woman whose strength had steadied them through storm and silence alike. And as night fell once more, lamps flickered in windows, stars shimmered above the sea, and Constantinople, wounded yet enduring, dreamed again. The months following the emperor's recovery unfolded with a mixture of relief and fragility. The city had survived, but it bore the memory of sorrow in quiet ways. Empty doorways stood as reminders of absent friends. Candlelit vigils lingered in the evenings, where neighbors gathered not for festivity, but for remembrance. Yet, with each sunrise, Constantinople showed that it would not allow despair to rule. Ships once more filled the harbors, sails bright against the horizon. The markets slowly swelled with voices, their exchanges tentative, but growing in strength, as if every purchase of grain, every barter for cloth, was an affirmation of life's return. Within the palace, Justinian resumed the pace of his governance, yet it was Theodora who often set the tone of resilience. Her voice, calm and measured, reminded ministers that laws were not abstract words, but lifelines for the people who endured hardship daily. She had seen enough of suffering to understand that governance required more than decrees of ambition. It required compassion, protection, and fairness, so she leaned more fully into the work that had already marked her reign. The laws protecting women from exploitation were not left as tokens but were expanded, refined, and enforced. In a society where widows could be left vulnerable, she pressed for measures to ensure they retained rights to property and inheritance. Where young girls were at risk of being forced into degrading trades, she demanded protection, insisting that no child should be denied dignity. Even within the palace, her attention extended to servants and attendants, ensuring they were cared for when ill, protected from abuse, granted stability in uncertain times. Her influence reached into courtrooms and into streets alike. Judges knew her, I was sharp upon them. Bribery or injustice could not be cloaked easily. When petitions came from women who felt unheard, she did not cast them aside. Instead, she listened, weighed their words, and carried their concerns into the chambers of power. It was said that to be heard by Theodora was to find not only sympathy but action, the rhythm of Byzantine. Life gave her the canvas upon which her compassion was painted. In neighborhoods that had seen too much loss, she supported new charities. Orphanages were strengthened, offering shelter, food, and the gentleness of care to children who otherwise might have wandered the streets. In monasteries, she supported communities of women who had chosen lives of devotion, ensuring they had the resources to thrive in prayer and service. Even theaters, once dismissed as places of disorder, became under her gaze spaces where performance could continue as art rather than degradation. She knew that the soul of a city lay not only in its churches and palaces, but in its daily joys, its laughter, its stories. As the empire healed, so too did its rhythms of work and rest return. The great workshops of Constantinople resumed their hum, looms weaving bolts of cloth that would sail across seas, metalworkers hammering bronze into forms both useful and beautiful. In the shipyards, wood was shaped into vessels that would carry goods and soldiers alike. Streets that had once been silent stirred again with commerce, vendors hawking figs and olives, potters arranging jars, jewelers setting out their glittering wares. The air was filled with familiar scents, bread fresh from ovens, roasted meats turning on spits, the tang of fish hauled from the bosque, spices dusting meals with flavors from distant lands. To walk the avenues once more was to sense the heartbeat of a city regaining strength. And Theodora, though cloistered in the palace much of the time, was attuned to this heartbeat, knowing that every decree she influenced would ripple outward to touch these lives. Evenings carried their own atmosphere of renewal. Where once laments had filled the air, music began to return. strings plucked softly, pipes blown in gentle tunes, songs sung in courtyards where families gathered in flickering lamplight. Children, resilient as always, played once more, their laughter carrying above rooftops. Storytellers wove tales not only of saints and martyrs, but of heroes who triumphed after hardship, their narratives echoing the city's own recovery. Hagia Sophia, too, became a beacon of healing. Its domes and vaults, shimmering with mosaics, seemed to embrace the faithful who gathered. The prayers sung there carried not only supplication but thanksgiving. The vast interior, filled with incense and song, was a balm for a weary people. To step inside was to feel lifted, as if the sorrow of the past months could be carried upward into light. Theodora herself often prayed within those walls, her presence quiet, her heart perhaps remembering not only the grandeur of her present, but the humility of her past. She had once been a woman of the streets, and now she stood beneath a dome meant to reflect heaven. Yet she did not forget the narrow alleys, the simple homes, the vulnerable lives that had shaped her understanding of human frailty. It was that memory, carried always within, that gave her governance its compassion. Justinian, for all his towering ambition, leaned increasingly on her counsel. He was a man of vision, of laws and conquests, yet he could be distant from the immediate needs of ordinary lives. Theodora bridged that distance. She reminded him of the people who sold bread in markets, who mended nets along the shore, who lit lamps each evening in humble rooms. She reminded him that empire was not only marble and gold, not only soldiers and victories, but flesh and breath and memory. In this balance their rule continued. Justinian pursued his great campaigns, sending generals across seas, commanding architects to raise wonders, dictating codes of law. Theodora ensured that the vulnerable were not forgotten amid such grandeur. Together, they represented both vision and compassion, ambition and endurance. And still, the daily life of the city unfolded in rhythms that carried a quiet majesty of their own. Imagine, for a moment, a single day within the city during this period of recovery. The dawn begins with the crowing of roosters in courtyards, the clatter of shutters thrown open to catch the cool morning air. The sea shimmers pale blue, dotted with sails drifting toward the harbor. Fishermen call to one another as they unload their catch, the sound of water lapping against hulls. In bakeries, ovens glow, bread emerging golden, its fragrance filling narrow lanes. Women with baskets hurry to markets, voices rising in bargaining, laughter beginning to thread through the stalls once more. By midday, the streets hum with activity. Officials walk in procession to courts, their robes brushing the stone. Artisans sit at their work, hammering, carving, weaving, their tools tapping in steady rhythms. Children dash through alleys, their games echoing. Priests pause in doorways, offering blessings to those who pass. Soldiers, polished and orderly, patrol the avenues, their presence both reassuring and commanding. As the sun lowers, families gather for meals, platters of bread and cheese, bowls of lentils, fruit fresh from gardens. Candles flicker as lamps are lit, shadows lengthening across walls. Courtyards fill with soft voices, with stories told and songs sung, with the gentle strumming of instruments. The city, alive again, breathes deeply in the cool of evening. And through it all, Theodora's presence lingers, not always seen but always felt. In the fairness of a judge's ruling, in the safety of a widow's home, in the laughter of children who no longer fear being cast aside, her influence rests quietly, steadily, like the glow of a lamp guiding through night. In these years, her legacy deepened. She had already shaped history in moments of riot and crisis, but her true power was revealed in the quieter times, when compassion was needed as much as courage. She proved that rulership was not only the art of command, but the art of care, not only the voice of decree, but the ear that listened. The empire, still grand, still ambitious, would face more trials ahead. Yet in this season of healing, it was Theodora's steady hand that guided, her memory of hardship that softened justice with mercy, her voice that reminded even the emperor himself of the human heart at the center of empire. And so the story flows onward, the city moving forward one day at a time, its lamps glowing at dusk, its prayers whispered at dawn, its resilience shining quietly in every small act of endurance. The years that followed brought both triumph and strain. Justinian, invigorated by recovery, turned again to his vast vision of empire restored. His generals pressed across seas, reclaiming lands in Italy and North Africa. writing dispatches filled with victories but also with hardships endured in foreign fields. Constantinople received these tidings with pride and unease alike. Pride, for the empire seemed to swell again toward the grandeur of Rome. Unease, for the cost in lives, in gold, and instability weighed heavy. Within the palace, Theodora's role grew ever more essential. She was not a general, nor a builder of armies, but she was the voice that reminded her husband of balance. While he dreamed of conquest, she kept her eyes upon the city, upon the daily lives of those who had already endured so much. She reminded him that victories abroad meant little if the people at home were left unprotected, hungry, or unheard. In council, her words carried weight. Ministers knew she could not be dismissed, that her presence was not ceremonial but substantial. When debates grew heated, when voices clashed over policy, hers was the calm tone that cut through, steady and precise. She spoke not in flourishes but in reasoned clarity, her logic sharpened by years of struggle, her compassion grounding every argument. Those who underestimated her soon learned that her will was not easily bent, that it was in these later years that her relationship with the Church also took center stage. The empire had long wrestled with questions of faith, of doctrine and authority. Justinian, keen to unify belief under imperial control, often clashed with bishops and patriarchs. Theodora, however, held sympathies that did not always align with her husband's rigid orthodoxy. She extended her protection to those deemed heretical by some, particularly the Monophysites, who believed in the single divine nature of Christ. For Theodora, this was not merely theological curiosity, it was compassion rooted in memory. She knew what it was to be cast out, to be dismissed as unworthy, and so she offered shelter to bishops driven from their sees, provided safety to monks pursued for their beliefs, and lent her ear to voices silenced elsewhere. To some, this made her a divisive figure. To others, it made her a guardian, a rare protector in an age of rigid boundaries. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Constantinople, reflected this tension and harmony alike. Built in the wake of riot, it had become the empire's heart of worship, its domes soaring as if heaven itself bent low to embrace the faithful. Theodora often stood beneath its glittering mosaics, her gaze lifting to the golden vaults. The air, rich with incense, filled her lungs as choirs sang with solemn beauty. The flicker of countless candles caught upon tesserae, their light shimmering like stars scattered across stone. For those who entered its vast space, the sensation was overwhelming. The city outside, with all its noise and tumult, seemed distant. Within, there was only song, only light, only the sense of being enfolded in something eternal. Theodora understood this power. She knew that for her people, faith was not an abstraction but a daily sustenance, a rhythm that carried them through uncertainty, and outside those sacred walls, life continued in its myriad textures. Constantinople in these years was not only a capital of empire but a tapestry of cultures. Syrians, Armenians, Egyptians, Greeks, Slavs, Persians, all walked its streets, their voices mingling in marketplaces, their wares displayed in colorful variety. Spices from India perfumed the air, silks from the east shimmered in the sun, glassware gleamed on stalls, while humble baskets of olives and figs grounded the abundance in simplicity. Artists found patronage in this environment. Painters adorned chapels with saints whose eyes seemed alive with compassion. Mosaic workers set tiny stones into great designs, each piece carefully placed to catch light in a way that seemed almost divine. Poets recited verses in quiet courtyards, their words drifting softly into twilight. Musicians plucked strings and blew pipes, their songs carrying across rooftops, mingling with the sound of gulls over the harbor. Daily life, though often difficult, held its quiet beauties. A mother brushing her daughter's hair by the window, a craftsman pausing to wipe sweat from his brow as he admires the object he has shaped. Children chasing one another down narrow alleys, their laughter bright against the worn stone. Lamps being lit at dusk, their glow warm against the cool air. These small moments, unrecorded by chroniclers, were the true essence of the city's resilience. Theodora carried an instinct for such details. Though her position placed her among marble halls and jeweled robes, her heart remained tied to the simple and the ordinary. She had once been among them, had known hunger, fear, and vulnerability, and so she did not forget. This memory colored her policies, her compassion, her stubborn insistence that the empire's greatness must include care for its most fragile souls. Even as age and illness began to touch her, she did not yield her strength. Those close to her noted that, though her body sometimes faltered, her will did not. She continued to press her husband toward justice, continued to shield those who had no other protector, continued to weave compassion into the fabric of imperial law. The city around her shifted with the seasons. In spring, blossoms filled gardens, their fragrance carried on breezes that swept through courtyards. In summer, the heat pressed heavy, and citizens sought the cool of shaded porticos, fountains trickling with refreshing streams. In autumn, harvests arrived from the provinces, markets rich with grain and fruit, wines uncorked in celebration. In winter, snow sometimes dusted rooftops, the sea darkened, fires burned brightly in hearths, and families drew close together for warmth. Through each season, the empire's heart continued to beat in steady rhythm. Priests rang bells at dawn, calling the faithful to prayer. Merchants cried their wares, their voices rising above the din. Fishermen hauled nets heavy with silver-scaled bounty. Children played with carved toys, their shouts echoing in alleys. And all the while, within the palace, Theodora shaped the currents of governance, her influence subtle but unyielding, her legacy growing with each passing year. It is in these quieter years, often overlooked by grand histories, that her greatness shone brightest. For it is easy to be remembered for moments of riot or plague, for times of crisis that demand heroism. It is harder to be remembered for the daily, patient work of compassion, for the steady shaping of laws, for the unseen listening that turned petitions into action. Yet this was the true strength of Theodora, the reason her name endures, not only as empress but as guardian, as protector, as one who remembered the forgotten. And so, as twilight deepened in her life, she remained what she had always been, a woman who endured, who transformed, who guided. She had risen from the most fragile of beginnings to the most exalted of thrones, and yet she had never lost sight of the humanity that bound her to those she ruled. The city at night, in those later years, reflected her story in its quiet beauty. Lamps glowing in countless windows, the sea shimmering under moonlight, choirs still singing in Hagia Sophia, their voices carrying through cool air, families whispering prayers before sleep, children drifting into dreams, artisans setting aside their tools with satisfaction, life continuing, tender and fragile, yet enduring. And within the palace, Theodora, Empress of Byzantium, sat in stillness, her presence calm, her influence vast, her memory of the past unforgotten, her heart turned always toward the care of those who needed it most. As the seasons turned and the empire pressed onward with its vast ambitions, the empress grew older. Time does not yield to crowns or jewels, and even in the halls of power, age and illness touched those who wore them. Theodora, who had once been known for her luminous vitality, now carried herself with a calmer presence, less radiant with youthful brilliance, but deepened by the gravity of years and the patience of wisdom. Whispers spread within the palace that she was unwell, though she showed little outward sign of weakness when appearing before the court. Illness, it was said, settled quietly in her body, but she did not allow it to shape the impression she gave. Her poise remained, her gaze steady, her words firm. If her strength faltered in private, it was not revealed in public. Justinian, though immersed in his endless labors, became ever more dependent on her counsel. The emperor, who had faced riot, plague, and endless campaigns, was not easily shaken. Yet he leaned on her voice with a trust that surpassed that of any advisor. In moments of uncertainty, he turned to her not only as wife, but as equal partner in governance. She had stood beside him when the empire quaked, had steadied him when he himself was laid low, had carried burdens that no minister could. Their bond, tested by time and trial, had become something immovable. It is said that when disputes arose in court, and Justinian hesitated, Theodora's calm words often tipped the balance. Sometimes she urged caution, reminding him of the people's burdens. At other times, she pressed for boldness, reminding him of the fragility of opportunity. He listened, not always agreeing, but always weighing her voice as one he could not ignore. This partnership was the hidden thread behind many of his reign's greatest achievements. Beyond the palace, Constantinople itself continued to shimmer with life. The city, perched between continents, remained a place of endless encounter. Festivals brightened its streets, the people gathering in joy after years of hardship. On feast days, churches filled with song, choirs lifting harmonies that carried through domes and arches, bells ringing in jubilant tones. Outside, Processions wound through avenues, banners lifted, icons carried high, incense curling into the open air. Children ran ahead of these processions, laughing as petals were scattered upon the ground. Women leaned from balconies to watch, their faces softened by the glow of candles carried below. Men bowed their heads in reverence, crossing themselves as sacred relics were displayed. The city, vast as it was, seemed in such moments to move with one heartbeat, united in rhythm of faith and celebration. At night, after festivals, the air lingered with the faint smoke of torches, the soft fragrance of flowers trodden underfoot, the echoes of hymns still drifting like memory. Families sat together in courtyards, sharing food, wine, and stories, their joy carrying long after the processions had ended. For the people of Constantinople, such gatherings were not merely entertainments but anchors, reminders that even in an age of uncertainty, moments of shared beauty could still be found. The arts, too, flourished in this environment. Poets recited verses at banquets and in quiet salons, their words weaving images of divine light, of heroic courage, of tender love. Painters covered chapel walls with serene saints, their features softened with compassion, their eyes seeming to gaze upon the viewer with understanding. Musicians composed hymns that carried both the grandeur of faith and the intimacy of prayer, their melodies floating into hearts with gentle power. Markets offered their own symphony, the cries of merchants, the chatter of buyers, the clink of coins exchanging hands. Spices perfumed the air, pepper and cinnamon mingling with the scent of roasting meat. Silks from distant lands gleamed in the sunlight, bolts of fabric unfurled in dazzling colors. Potters displayed jars and lamps, their surfaces smooth and shining. Jewelers laid out trinkets that caught the eye, from the simplest bronze ring to elaborate gold pieces set with gems. To walk through the marketplace was to taste the breadth of empire itself, condensed into one bustling space. Even as she grew weary in body, Theodora did not neglect her attention to such rhythms of life. She knew that for the empire to thrive, its people must feel not only governed but cared for. She continued to press for measures to shield women from exploitation, to provide for orphans, to ensure the poor were not forgotten in times of plenty. She was not naive. She knew her power was not limitless, yet within its bounds she worked, ensuring that her legacy would be more than marble or memory, but living change that touched lives. The palace itself, though steeped in formality, bore witness to her gentleness and quieter ways. Servants remembered her not only as an empress who commanded, but as a woman who spoke to them with dignity, who noticed their labors, who ensured their needs were not neglected. She had risen far above the world she had once known, but she had not forgotten the feel of its hardship. Evenings in the palace often carried a mood of solemn beauty. Lamps flickered along corridors, their flames reflected in polished stone. Musicians played soft tunes in chambers where courtiers gathered, their notes drifting like lullabies. Conversations, hushed and formal, gave way at times to laughter, though quieter than in youth. And at the center, Theodora often sat in calm composure, her face lit by lamp glow, her presence steadying the gathering. Outside those walls, the city at night carried its own atmosphere. The sea, dark and vast, reflected the moon, its waves lapping steadily against the shore. Gulls cried faintly in the distance. Dogs barked in alleys, then fell silent. Candles flickered in windows. Families gathered within. The murmur of prayers carried faintly, voices lifted before sleep. Constantinople rested, vast yet intimate, a city both grand and deeply human. Theodora, though marked by illness, found strength in such details. She had always been sustained not only by power but by memory, by the small moments of human life that spoke of endurance. As her body grew frailer, she seemed to draw deeper into the essence of what mattered: justice, compassion, resilience. The emperor, too, felt the weight of her presence more profoundly in these years. He had always been ambitious, his gaze fixed upon maps, upon laws, upon monuments. But with Theodora by his side, his rule was tempered, softened, deepened. He relied upon her as on no other, not only for counsel but for companionship, for the steady light she offered in times of shadow. Together they watched the empire unfold through triumph and trial. Together they prayed within Hagia Sophia, their voices lifted with the choir, their souls bent in reverence. Together they sat in chambers where ministers debated, their gazes steady, their decisions shaping history. And together, though their paths had begun in worlds so far apart, They stood as one of the most remarkable pairs to ever share a throne that, as years passed, Constantinople continued to dazzle, its walls and domes gleaming in the sun, its harbors crowded with sails, its streets alive with voices. But for Theodora, life's horizon drew nearer. She faced it not with fear, but with the calm that had always marked her spirit. She had risen from fragility to strength, from obscurity to empire, and she had carried with her always the memory of those who had no voice. That memory, now, was her gift to history. On festival nights, when the city shimmered with torchlight and music, she must have watched with quiet satisfaction. Children laughing, families singing, prayers rising. These were the signs of a people who endured, who carried beauty even in hardship. To have played her part in guarding them, in guiding them, was enough. And so, even as illness grew, she continued her work. Her presence calm, her gaze steady, her influence undimmed. The empress who had once defied rioters, who had stood firm in plague, who had softened laws with compassion, remained to the very end a figure of unyielding grace. As the years advanced, the empress's illness deepened, though she concealed it with practiced poise. The halls of the palace still saw her walk with grace, her robes trailing softly across mosaicked floors, her voice steady when she addressed courtiers. Yet behind closed doors her strength waned. Those closest to her spoke in whispers, noting the shadows beneath her eyes, the weariness that seemed to press upon her frame. Theodora had lived a life of intensity. Her rise had been swift, her years on the throne demanding. The burdens of empire weigh heavily on any ruler, and hers had been borne not only as consort but as sovereign. Her hand felt in laws, in judgments, in the very rhythm of imperial policy. Now, her body asked its price. Justinian felt the weight of her decline most keenly. His days were still filled with endless documents, councils, and visions of conquest, but each evening he turned to her chambers, listening to her words as though they carried not only wisdom, but the very pulse of his own heart. When she was too weak to sit at council, he carried her counsel with him, repeating her advice to ministers as if she were present in spirit. Her illness did not still her mind. From her bed, she summoned secretaries, dictated letters, and continued to shape decrees. She asked to be updated on cases involving the vulnerable, and when injustices appeared, she pressed for their correction. The empress's will remained clear and sharp, her compassion undimmed, even as her body betrayed her. Outside the palace, Constantinople carried on in its eternal rhythm. The city, so alive with trade and ceremony, continued to weave its endless tapestry. Ships filled the harbors, bringing goods from Egypt, Syria, Italy, and the far Black Sea. Wheat poured into the granaries, olive oil filled amphorae, and spices perfumed the air of markets. The empire's reach could be tasted in every loaf of bread, every drop of wine, every thread of silk that shimmered in the stalls. Citizens filled the baths, steam rising into vaulted chambers, voices echoing as friends conversed, laughed, and shared news. Old men leaned on walking sticks, recounting tales of earlier emperors. Youth splashed in the warm pools, their chatter light and bright. Merchants met there, deals sealed, not with contracts but with nods, sealed amid the comfort of shared leisure. To wander the baths was to feel the pulse of the city itself, warm and human, steady beneath the grandeur of empire. The churches, too, glowed with life. Priests lifted their voices in endless chants, services flowing from dawn until dusk, incense coiling upward into domes painted with saints. The faithful stood in rows, candles flickering in their hands, prayers whispered with intensity. Hagia Sophia remained the crown of these places, its vast space embracing the faithful in a grandeur that stirred both awe and intimacy. To step inside was to feel the immensity of heaven itself pressing close. Theodora, when well enough, still visited. She would be carried discreetly, not always able to walk, but still determined to join the worship of the people, to kneel on marble, to lift her gaze to the shimmering mosaics of Christ Pantocrator. Above these moments brought her solace. Those who saw her at prayer remembered her serenity, her focus, her sense that even as empress she was but one soul before the divine. Seasons turned as her illness advanced. Winter cloaked the city in quiet, snow settling upon rooftops and courtyards. The Bosporus, a grey ribbon under clouded skies. Fires glowed in hearths, children clustered around them, listening to elders tell stories of saints and heroes. In the markets, merchants stamped their feet against the cold, their breaths visible as they offered goods. their voices muffled by the frost in the air. Spring returned with blossoms spilling over gardens, the scent of orange and almond trees drifting on breezes. The city shook off its heaviness, laughter rising once again in the streets. Fishermen's boats bobbed upon waters bright with sunlight, their nets heavy with silver-scaled catches. Bakers filled baskets with warm bread, the air rich with its fragrance. Through these cycles, Theodora's presence lingered like a steadying note. Even when absent from the public eye, her influence was felt. Laws passed still bore her spirit, protective of the weak, mindful of women's place, careful of justice. Justinian, though consumed with his conquests in Italy and Africa, carried her voice in his decisions, as though she remained always at his side. Their bond deepened further in these years of trial. In the evenings, the emperor sat beside her, sometimes speaking of affairs of state, other times recalling memories of their earlier years. They remembered the day of the Nika riots, when she had declared she would not flee. They remembered the dedication of Hagia Sophia, when its dome gleamed like heaven itself. They remembered quiet nights when laughter had filled their chambers. These shared memories were their treasure, their fortress against the encroachment of time. Even as Theodora's body weakened, her mind remained sharp, her will unbent. She urged Justinian to continue his vision, to build, to legislate, to leave behind a legacy worthy of the empire. She knew that history would judge him, and by extension, would judge them both. And so she pushed him to greatness. Even as her own strength dwindled, in the streets beyond the palace, the people still spoke of her. Women especially held her in esteem, remembering her reforms, her efforts to shield them from exploitation, her establishment of safe houses where those cast aside could find refuge. To them she was not merely an empress but a guardian, one who had remembered their struggles, even when clothed in splendor. Her name was spoken in prayers, whispered in gratitude, carried in songs sung quietly by mothers to their daughters. The city's heartbeat did not falter, even as pestilence threatened again in distant provinces, even as armies clashed on borders. Constantinople's daily life rolled onward. Bakers baked, teachers instructed, fishermen cast their nets, children played in courtyards. The empire was immense, yet it was sustained by these small, enduring gestures, these threads of ordinary life. Theodora, from her chambers, took comfort in the thought that she had played a role in protecting this life, in preserving its beauty. Nights in the palace grew quieter as her illness advanced. Courtiers moved softly, servants carried lamps with careful steps, conversations hushed as they neared her chambers. Theodora lay surrounded by silks, yet she seemed most at peace when her windows were left open. The sound of the sea drifting in, the night breeze carrying with it the scents of the city, the salt of the Bosporus, the faint spice of markets, the smoke of distant hearths. At times, she asked for musicians to play softly. The tones of lyres and flutes filled her room like whispers, soothing her weary body. Sometimes she requested hymns, the voices of choirs reminding her of the vast cathedral she had loved. Other times, silence sufficed, the quiet rhythm of her own breath mingling with the faint murmur of the city outside. Justinian, seated beside her bed, often clasped her hand. The emperor who commanded legions, who ordered monuments into being, who reshaped laws and borders, was in these moments simply a man with his wife, holding fast to the bond that had carried them through decades of power and trial. To him, she was not merely empress but anchor, the one whose courage had steadied his greatest decisions, whose love had been his truest refuge. As the days stretched into weeks, it became clear that her time was drawing short, yet there was no sense of fear about her, only calm acceptance. She had lived with courage, and she would depart with it. Those who attended her in those final months spoke of her serenity, her refusal to complain, her quiet gaze that seemed always to look beyond pain, beyond frailty, toward something larger. Constantinople itself seemed to sense the change. The city moved as it always had, yet within the palace a stillness grew, a recognition that one of its guiding lights was fading. Ministers came more frequently to consult, Justinian lingering longer by her side, servants moving with reverence. The empress, who had once dazzled with her presence, now radiated a different kind of power, the quiet authority of a soul at peace. On summer evenings, when the sky glowed with fading gold, she would sometimes ask for her curtains to be drawn wide. She watched as swallows darted in the twilight, as the waters shimmered with last light, as the city hushed into night. These simple sights seemed to soothe her more than jewels or treasures. She had risen to the heights of empire, but at the end, it was the gentle beauty of nature, the hum of human life, the steady rhythm of faith that filled her heart. The days lengthened, and the Empress's strength dwindled further. Her attendants moved gently around her chamber, their footsteps soft on polished stone, their voices hushed as though even sound might disturb her fragile body. Curtains of silk filtered the sunlight into a tender glow, casting the room in warmth without glare. On tables nearby, bowls of fruit and pitchers of water stood. Though she took little, flowers, always fresh, filled the air with quiet fragrance: lilies, roses, sprigs of basil, gifts from those who loved her presence and sought to ease her rest. Theodora remained lucid. Though weakened, she summoned those closest to her. Speaking in measured tones, she gave instructions for charities she had founded, reminding them that the women sheltered in her homes were not to be neglected. She pressed ministers to ensure that laws protecting the vulnerable would endure beyond her. These were her concerns to the last, not her own comfort, but the welfare of those too easily overlooked by the machinery of empire. Her voice, though faint, retained the same steady calm that had once stilled a panicked court. Listeners bent close, taking in each word, knowing they heard not only their empress but a woman whose life had shaped an era. Justinian rarely left her side. The emperor's robes grew rumpled, his beard unkempt, for he cared little for appearances in those weeks. His attendants urged him to rest, but he lingered near her, often clasping her hand, his eyes fixed upon her face. The ruler who had commanded armies, rebuilt cities, and reshaped laws was in these moments simply a husband, unwilling to release the companion who had steadied his reign. Their conversations in those final evenings were quiet. At times, she reminded him of duties yet to come, laws unfinished, projects incomplete. At other times, their words wandered back into memory. She recalled the small apartment where they had first shared private laughter, the tense hours of the Nika riots when she had refused to flee, the triumph of Hagia Sophia's dedication. He spoke of his gratitude, how no achievement would have been possible without her counsel. Their memories wove together into a tapestry that stretched across decades, rich with trials and victories, threaded through with devotion. Outside their chamber, the empire continued its endless rhythm. Messengers arrived from distant provinces, soldiers drilled in barracks, markets bustled with trade. Yet within the palace, time seemed to slow. Courtiers moved with solemn care. Ministers awaited summons in tense silence, all aware that a great presence was slipping away. Theodora's illness, though private, cast its shadow over the entire court, for all knew that her influence reached far beyond these walls. Nights were quiet, but not silent. From the open windows, faint sounds of the city drifted in, the creak of ships at harbor, the bark of dogs in distant alleys, the occasional laughter of late-night revelers. These noises of ordinary life comforted her, reminders of the people she had always carried in her heart. Constantinople did not still for her illness, and she would not have wished it to. The city breathed steadily, alive with its millions, enduring as it always had. One evening, as the sun sank low, she asked to be raised slightly so she might gaze outside. From her window, she saw the sky painted with gentle shades of rose and gold. The dome of Hagia Sophia glowed in that light, luminous against the horizon. She watched silently for a long time, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Those who stood nearby believed she drew strength from the sight. The cathedral that had risen from riot and ruin now, a vision of eternal beauty. Her decline came gradually, not with sudden violence, but with quiet lessening. Each day her voice grew softer, her body lighter, her breaths more measured. Yet her mind remained, her gaze still steady, her will unbroken. In her presence, attendants felt not fear but peace. At last, the day came when her strength could hold no longer. She lay upon silken pillows, the room dim and filled with the fragrance of incense. Justinian sat close, her hand in his eyes fixed upon hers. Ministers and servants lingered nearby, silent, their faces heavy with grief. Theodora's final words, whispered faintly, were of reassurance. She urged Justinian to continue, to build, to rule with justice, to remember compassion. She reminded him that power was fleeting but that acts of mercy endured. And then, with calm acceptance, she let go, her breath fading like a candle's flame, her presence passing into stillness. The silence that followed was profound. In that chamber, time seemed to stop. The emperor bent over her, his grief unshielded, his shoulders shaking as he wept openly. Those present bowed their heads, some in prayer, others in tears. An empress who had risen from obscurity to command the empire had departed, leaving behind not only sorrow but a legacy that would ripple through generations. That news spread through the palace with hushed gravity, then beyond into the city. Bells tolled in churches, their deep voices echoing across neighborhoods. Priests lifted prayers, choirs sang laments, incense rose in heavy clouds. In markets, whispers spread from stall to stall. Women wept openly, men bowed their heads, children asked questions their elders struggled to answer. For the people of Constantinople, she had been more than a distant ruler. She had been their guardian, their advocate, their empress. The funeral rites were solemn, grand, yet suffused with an air of tenderness. Her body was arrayed in imperial robes, her head crowned, her hands folded upon her chest. She was carried through streets lined with mourners, thousands pressing close to glimpse her one final time. Petals were scattered upon her bier, candles lifted in trembling hands, voices rising in hymns of mourning. The procession moved slowly, each step accompanied by chants that carried like waves through the city. The cathedral of Hagia Sophia received her. Its vast dome, filled with light, seemed to embrace her as she was laid before the altar. Priests intoned prayers, choirs lifted laments that echoed against marble and gold, their harmonies mingling with the grief of the people. Justinian knelt beside her, his tears falling freely, his head bowed. The emperor who had commanded legions now seemed but one grieving man. Outside, the city stilled in reverence. Merchants closed their stalls, fishermen lowered their nets, even animals seemed subdued. Constantinople itself seemed to mourn, its heartbeat slowed by the loss of the empress who had shaped its spirit. In the days that followed, laments continued. Stories of Theodora were told in homes, her name spoken in prayers. Mothers reminded daughters of her courage, fathers praised her wisdom, poets composed verses in her honor. Though she was gone, her presence lingered like perfume in the air, like sunlight remembered long after sunset. Justinian, bereft, returned to his labors, but he was never the same. His grief marked him deeply, yet he carried her memory as a guiding star. He pressed forward with his laws, his conquests, his buildings, but always, in his heart, he sought to fulfill what she had urged: to rule with justice, to temper ambition with mercy, to remember that compassion outlasts power. Theodora's passing marked not only the end of a life but the close of an extraordinary chapter. She had risen from a childhood of hardship, from the roughness of stage and street, to stand at the very pinnacle of empire. She had faced ridicule, resistance, and riot, yet she had never faltered. She had shaped laws that endured, offered protection to the powerless, and stood as equal beside an emperor. Her story was unlikely, yet it unfolded with undeniable force, leaving a mark no historian could erase. For the people of Constantinople, she remained alive in memory. In the laughter of children she had helped to shelter, in the prayers of women she had defended, in the chants that filled Hagia Sophia, her spirit lingered. Even as time carried the empire onward, even as new rulers rose and fell, her name endured. Theodora, Empress, Protector, Queen of Courage. As night settled upon the city in those days of mourning, candles flickered in windows, prayers rose from countless lips, the sea lapped steadily against the shore. Constantinople breathed on, vast and eternal, carrying her legacy within its heart. And though the palace no longer heard her voice, the empire itself carried her memory like a quiet, steady flame, burning softly in the dark. After her passing, Constantinople slowly resumed its rhythm, though the absence of the empress lingered like a shadow across its marble avenues and golden domes. The bells of Hagia Sophia no longer tolled with mourning, yet their sound seemed quieter, more solemn, as if the great cathedral itself remembered. Life in the empire continued, as it always must, but memory, soft and enduring, lived on in every corner where her influence had once touched. Justinian carried the loss within him, though he returned with vigor to the duties of rule, overseeing laws, directing armies, expanding his architectural vision. Those who knew him best observed a deepening in his gaze, a gravity that had not been present before. He worked late into the nights, scrolls spread before him, lamps burning long past midnight, the hum of scribes filling the stillness. Yet sometimes he paused, staring into nothing, as though listening for a voice that no longer spoke aloud. Her counsel had been his compass. Now he sought to follow its direction by memory alone. The empire, to bore her imprint long after she was gone. Laws she had urged remained in place, protecting women from forced exploitation, safeguarding the vulnerable, creating sanctuaries for those cast aside. Institutions she had founded continued their work, caring for the poor and the forgotten. These were not monuments of stone alone, but living legacies, sustained in the daily mercies of shelter, food, and safety. While marble might crumble and mosaics fade, such acts of compassion carried forward quietly, imperceptibly, into the lives of generations. Historians who wrote after her lifetime offered varied portraits. Some praised her courage and wisdom, marveling at her rise from obscurity to power. Others, colored by prejudice against her origins, dismissed her with scorn. Yet even in criticism, they could not erase her. The very vehemence of their words betrayed her significance. A figure easily forgotten would not have stirred such passion. And so, across the centuries, her name persisted, controversial, luminous, unforgettable. The people, in their simpler way, remembered differently. Among women especially, her reputation endured as a protector. Stories of her strength circulated in homes and gatherings, mothers telling daughters how the empress had once refused to flee, how she had stood firm when men wavered. In the quiet songs sung to children, in the whispered prayers of widows and orphans, her name remained not as a subject of debate but as a source of courage. Constantinople itself continued to thrive, its life a ceaseless tide. The markets bustled with the cries of merchants, spices perfumed the air, silks shimmered in the sunlight, ships arrived with wheat, oil, and wine, their sails bright against the horizon. Processions wound through avenues on feast days, banners lifted, incense curling into the air, choirs chanting harmonies that carried 4 blocks. Life pulsed on, yet within this constant rhythm, her memory lingered like a gentle refrain, shaping the atmosphere of the city. In evenings long after her death, when the sun sank into the Bosporus and the city glowed with lamplight, citizens would sit in courtyards and recall tales of the empress. They remembered the Nika riots, when she had declared she would not abandon her throne. They remembered her charities, her decrees, her steadying influence beside the emperor. Each retelling softened into legend, her presence woven deeper into the fabric of Byzantine identity. The palace itself, though filled with new sounds, new ministers, new decisions, still held echoes of her steps. In the chambers where she had once spoken firm words, in the courtyards where she had walked in calm authority, memory lingered. Servants who had known her spoke of her dignity, her composure, her rare moments of gentle kindness. For them, she was not only an empress but a woman of presence, whose gaze could steady the room. Time carried forward, as it always does. Justinian lived on for many years after her, his reign long and ambitious, his projects vast. Yet even as he pressed onward, her absence remained. When he inaugurated great buildings, he must have remembered her pride at Hagia Sophia. When he signed new laws, he must have thought of her insistence upon mercy. When he sat alone in chambers filled with documents, he must have felt the silence where her counsel once resounded. Centuries passed, and the empire itself changed. Wars reshaped its borders, emperors rose and fell, new generations were born, lived, and died. Constantinople remained at the center of this vast unfolding, its walls battered but enduring, its domes gleaming against the sky, its streets alive with the same human energies that had filled them in Theodora's day. And through it all, her story continued to be told. In later ages, when travelers spoke of Byzantium, her name was often mentioned beside Justinian's, not only as wife or consort, but as curula partner, force in her own right. Her story fascinated precisely because it defied expectation. A woman of humble beginnings, who ascended not only to a throne but to lasting influence. In an age when women were often consigned to silence, she spoke, and history remembered. And so her legacy rests not only in the laws she shaped or the buildings she inspired, but in the larger truth her life embodies, that strength can arise from unlikely places, that courage can shine even in the darkest hours, that dignity can endure beyond scorn. She remains a figure of paradox, criticized yet admired, doubted yet revered, diminished by some yet exalted by others. And in that paradox lies her immortality. The city she once ruled continues in memory. Imagine again its streets at dusk, lamps flickering in windows, the scent of bread drifting from bakeries, the laughter of children echoing through courtyards. The sea lapped steadily against the harbor, sails lowering in the fading light. Priests chant in chapels, their voices soft and unbroken, prayers rising into the night. In such moments, one can almost sense her presence still, quiet but enduring, watching over the city she had loved and guarded. Perhaps, in the calm of evening, when the wind stirs gently through the colonnades, when the mosaics of saints shimmer in candlelight, when the city seems to breathe in one slow rhythm, Theodora's memory moves softly through Constantinople, not as a ghost but as a spirit woven into its essence. For though her body rests in the earth, her story has taken root in the soul of the empire, and through stories she lives on. And so, as we bring this long reflection to its close, we leave her not in sorrow but in peace. Theodora's journey, from a childhood of hardship, through the shadows of theatre and brothel, to the dazzling height of imperial rule, stands complete. She faced riot and plague, scorn and resistance, yet she never faltered. She shaped laws with compassion, steadied an emperor with courage, and left behind a legacy that endures across centuries. History remembers her as many things: actress, courtesan, wife, empress. Yet above all, it remembers her as one who rose beyond expectation, who carried strength into a place where none imagined it could exist, who turned the course of empire with calm resolve. Her life is a reminder that greatness often emerges from unlikely origins, that dignity is not the gift of birth but the work of will. Now the lamps dim, the city grows quiet, and Constantinople rests under the gaze of stars. The waves lap gently at the harbor, a lullaby older than empire. The domes and spires gleam faintly in moonlight, their outlines softened by shadow. Families settle into sleep, prayers whispered, candles extinguished. The empire breathes on, vast yet serene. And within that stillness, the memory of Theodora remains, steady as a flame sheltered from the wind. A flame that lights the past, that warms the present, that continues to glow in the story told tonight. Sleep now, with her story gently closing. Let the murmurs of Byzantium drift into dream, the rustle of robes, the toll of distant bells, the quiet lapping of the Bosporus, all fading into silence. The Empress rests, the empire continues, and you, too, may rest in the calm of history's embrace.